The judge smirked as she stepped forward, clutching a dusty notebook instead of legal proof. Confident in his authority, he believed this would be over in minutes. But when she opened that notebook, everything changed. A single sentence sparked. Whispers a witness stood up uninvited, and the courtroom flipped. Suddenly, it wasn't just about her orchard. It was about corruption, silence, and a secret buried by the city itself. Want to know what happened? Watch until the end, and don't miss this story full of emotion and unexpected twists. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments, and subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. Judith Woods woke before dawn, as she always did. Her small orchard outside Redwood Falls was bathed in pale morning light. Quietly humming a familiar tune her late husband Henry had loved, she watered the peach trees and admired the blossoms that promised a good harvest. The orchard had been their sanctuary, a piece of land that Henry had bought with his savings and sealed with a handshake decades ago. They had never worried about official documents or property deeds. Their word had been enough back then, but today the stillness was shattered by a sudden earth-shaking rumble. Judith dropped her watering can, startled. She stepped out from beneath the trees and saw dust clouds rising in the distance. Confused and frightened, she hurried toward the driveway in her worn slippers. A convoy of bulldozers and trucks roared toward her orchard. Men wearing bright orange vests climbed out, carrying clipboards and paperwork she didn't recognize. Panic surged through her chest as she realized they were heading straight for her property. Judith rushed forward, waving her hands desperately, trying to stop them. "Wait! What's happening?" she cried, her voice trembling. A crew leader glanced at her indifferently, handing her a crumpled piece of paper. "City orders, ma'am. We're clearing the land for the new bypass road." Judith's heart sank. "But this is my home. Nobody ever told me about any road. Please, just let me gather my things." The man shook his head impatiently. "We have our orders. You should have received notices months ago. There's nothing we can do now." Judith pleaded with tears streaming down her cheeks, begging for just a few moments to rescue the precious keepsakes from her home. Photos of Henry, the family Bible, even the small, hand-drawn orchard blueprint Henry had proudly sketched out. So many years ago, but the machines rolled on, deafening and relentless. Judith stood helplessly as metal jaws crushed her fruit trees, splintered the wooden walls of her modest home, and tore apart a lifetime of quiet dedication. Dust filled the air, coating her faded housecoat. She could barely breathe, let alone comprehend what was happening. In mere hours, everything she cherished had been reduced to rubble. The orchard, the home, the memories, all flattened and destroyed. Amid the chaos, she fell to her knees, clutching only a small notebook she'd hastily grabbed. In it were dates, notes, and sketches, a fragile record of her life's gentle work. As the last truck pulled away, Judith felt an ache deeper than sorrow. Rising slowly, gripping her notebook, she realized she could not allow her dignity to be flattened along with everything else. She would fight, not just for herself, but for Henry, whose memory deserved better. Somehow, she would find justice, no matter how impossible it seemed. Judith brushed dust from her sleeve, took a breath, and turned toward Redwood Falls. Her quiet life was over. Her battle was just beginning. The next morning, Judith stood before the courthouse of Redwood Falls, a faded building with flaking white columns and a bronze plaque that hadn't been polished in years. The notebook trembled in her hand, its pages creased and stained with orchard soil. She hadn't slept much. All night she had sat by the window of a friend's guest room, staring out into the dark, wondering if she even stood a chance. But something inside her, grief mixed with quiet resolve, had whispered, "Go. Be heard." Inside, the courthouse buzzed with suits and hushed voices. Lawyers leafed through files, bailiffs barked orders, and clerks rushed past with arms full of documents. No one noticed the elderly woman in the floral blouse and worn shoes clutching a notebook to her chest. No one but a young intern who paused, for a second, watching her with a confused glance before hurrying off. When her case was finally called, a hush fell over the room. Judith rose from the wooden bench and walked to the front. Each step felt heavier than the last. The judge overseeing her hearing was Jorge Garcia, known for his strict courtroom and sharp tongue. Rumor had it he'd grown up poor but had no patience for excuses. Some admired him, others feared him. He sat tall behind the bench, robe pressed, glasses perched low on his nose. "Ms. Woods," he said without looking up, "are you representing yourself?" "Yes, Your Honor," Judith replied, voice clear despite the nervous knot in her throat. "I couldn't find a lawyer who would take my case. I was told it wasn't worth it." At that, Judge Garcia finally looked at her. His eyes scanned the frail woman before him, noting the absence of any legal counsel, the absence of folders, binders, exhibits, everything he was used to seeing in serious cases. "And what exactly are you hoping to accomplish here today, Ms. Woods?" She held up the notebook. "I don't want money, I don't want revenge. I just want the truth heard. I want someone to admit that what they did to me was wrong." A few quiet murmurs rippled through the courtroom. In the back, a man in a sleek navy suit, Mike Edwards, the city's attorney, watched with thinly veiled annoyance. This was supposed to be routine, but now, with eyes on him and the judge watching closely, he realized it might be more complicated than expected. Garcia narrowed his eyes. "Proceed," he said, folding his hands. And Judith opened her notebook. She turned to the first page with care, as if each line were a memory being reborn. Her voice remained steady, though her fingers trembled slightly. "This is the day, Henry, and I planted our first tree," she said softly, pointing to a handwritten entry from nearly 3 decades ago. "March 14th, 1992, a peach sapling. He said it would feed us long after we were gone." The courtroom listened, unmoving. She flipped to another page. "Here's when the local children came to pick apples for the school fundraiser. And here," she said, holding up a faded photograph taped to the corner, "is our orchard in bloom. We built it with our hands, without loans, without titles, just with love and work." Judge Garcia leaned slightly forward. His face remained unreadable, but his gaze didn't leave the notebook. Before he could say anything, Mike Edwards rose from his chair with practiced ease. "Your Honor," he began, his voice clipped and confident, "while Ms. Woods's recollections are heartfelt, none of this qualifies as legal evidence. There's no deed, no record of sale, no property taxes. The city acted within its full legal right to reclaim that land. What we're hearing now is sentiment, not statute." Judith looked up at him, calm and unwavering. "I understand. I don't." "Speak your language, Mr. Edwards," she said gently. "But I speak truth. I lived on that land for over 30 years. I paid the water and electric bills. I tended that orchard through storms and dry summers. I wrote letters to the city, asking if we'd be affected by that road project. I never got a single reply." Edwards scoffed. "And where are these letters now?" Judith reached into her notebook, pulling out wrinkled pages, copies of handwritten messages she had sent to the town hall, some even stamped by the post office. The ink was smudged in places, but the dates were clear. Judge Garcia took a long pause, then gestured to a clerk. "Collect those letters." He turned to Edwards. "Mr. Edwards will examine whether the city responded to these inquiries. In the meantime, let Ms. Woods continue." The attorney's jaw tightened. He didn't like the direction this was heading. As Judith resumed, her voice quiet but firm, something began to shift. The courtroom no longer saw a confused old woman with a worn-out notebook. They saw a witness to something the law had failed to protect, a life's work crushed without warning. One by one, Judith's pages unfolded a quiet legacy. Small notations in careful handwriting, names of neighbors who had come by for fresh eggs, fruit, or simply to sit under the shade of the trees. Her notebook was less a legal document and more a living memory, inked over years of sunrises, hard work, and loss. But across the aisle, Mike Edwards was growing restless. He adjusted his cuffs and rose again. "Your Honor, I must reiterate, emotional appeals, while moving, do not establish legal ownership. The city posted public notices regarding the road construction just as required by law. Ms. Woods either ignored them or failed to act in time." Before Garcia could reply, a quiet voice called from the back, "That's not true." All eyes turned as Garcia, Mary Gonzalez, a retired schoolteacher, stood slowly. The bailiff hesitated, but the judge gave her a slight nod. "I live 3 doors down from Ms. Woods," Mary said. "I walk my dog past her orchard every morning. Not once did I see a notice posted on her gate or anywhere nearby. If there had been one, I'd have told her myself." Edwards immediately objected. "Hearsay, Your Honor." Judge Garcia held upper hand. "We'll allow brief testimony." Mary's voice grew steadier. "She was never warned. They just came in and took it all. No notice, no compensation, nothing." The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that makes people look down, unsure where they stand anymore. Then another hand rose. Timothy Brown, a local produce vendor, stepped forward. "I bought apples from Judith every season," he said. "A month before the demolition, she asked me if I'd heard anything about the bypass. She was worried. She told me she had written to the city, said she never got a response." Judge Garcia leaned back slightly, his fingers laced under his chin. "Mr. Edwards, do you have documentation proving those notices were properly posted?" The attorney hesitated. "We're still compiling the city's records." "Compile. Faster," the judge replied coldly. Judith stood quietly, her notebook now resting against her chest. For the first time, she wasn't standing alone, and as more people in the gallery began to murmur, it became clear this wasn't just about one woman and a forgotten orchard. This was about something deeper. The courtroom had come expecting a formality, but now they were witnessing something far more powerful, truth cutting through silence. Momentum continued to shift. The room, once filled with passive observers, now leaned forward, captivated. More than just a case was unfolding. This was a reckoning. Judge Garcia called for a short recess. As the room emptied into the hallway, hushed voices buzzed with disbelief. Judith remained seated at the plaintiff's table, her notebook closed but resting gently under her hand, like a promise. In chambers, the judge requested access to the city's full expropriation file. A clerk returned minutes later with a thin manila folder, much thinner than Garcia expected for a project that had bulldozed multiple properties. He flipped through the contents, blueprints, timelines, and a typed summary of the road development. But as he turned to the last page, something caught his eye. In the margin of a dated memo, barely legible, was a handwritten note. "Proceed without occupant notification. Mayor's directive." He stared at it for a long moment. The words stirred something old and uncomfortable. Years ago, he had witnessed a similar injustice. A family evicted without due process. Back then, he was just a junior clerk. He'd stayed quiet, afraid to lose his job. But that moment had haunted him, becoming part of the reason he chose law, then the bench. Now here it was again. The same silence, the same disregard. By the time Garcia returned to the courtroom, his demeanor had changed. He no longer looked like a man performing a routine. There was a storm building behind his calm exterior. He addressed Edwards without ceremony. "I've reviewed the city's file. Would you like to explain this note?" He held up the memo, tapping the margin with his finger. The attorney walked slowly to the bench, scanned the paper, and paled. "That wasn't meant for the official record," he said. "It's informal, internal. It holds no legal weight." Garcia's stare was unblinking. "It might not, but it suggests intent, negligence, a deliberate bypass of lawful procedure." Murmurs broke out again among the gallery. Judith didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence now echoed louder than any accusation. What had started as a simple hearing was unraveling into something much greater, an exposure of a system willing to crush a life for convenience. And in that moment, the courtroom felt less like a place of law and more like a place in desperate search of justice. As the judge's words hung in the air, the weight of what was happening settled over everyone like a heavy fog. Mike Edwards adjusted his tie, his confidence visibly cracking. He tried to recover. "Your Honor, I must remind this court," he began, voice thinner now, "that without a legal deed, Ms. Woods has no rightful claim to the property. Even if the city's process had gaps, the fact remains. She never officially owned the land." Before Garcia could respond, a woman stood in the audience. She looked to be in her 70s, her silver hair tied back in a neat braid. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice steady, "but I remember that orchard. I remember Henry building the house with his own 2 hands. The judge motioned for her to approach. "I'm Lena Carter," she continued. "I taught 3rd grade for 32 years, lived 2 blocks from Judith. My late husband was friends with Henry. That land was theirs, always was. They grew food, shared it with the neighborhood, donated fruit to the church pantry every fall." Gasps rippled quietly through the gallery. Another hand went up, then another, and another. One by one, townspeople rose, people who had sat in that courtroom expecting a routine matter, but now felt compelled to speak. "I used to buy my eggs from her every Sunday. She taught my daughter how to can peaches. She let the kids build a scarecrow in the field every Halloween, said it kept away more than birds." Judge Garcia listened without interruption. Edwards tried to interject, but the wave of testimonies couldn't be stopped. They weren't legal statements, but they were something else, something deeper. A chorus of lived experiences, shared memories, and gratitude. The community wasn't just backing Judith. They were standing for her. When the room finally fell quiet, Garcia looked at Edwards with a calm that cut sharper than anger. "I see now this isn't about one piece of land," he said. "It's about whether the law exists to protect people, or to erase them when it's convenient." Edwards didn't respond. He simply lowered his eyes. Judith, overwhelmed, placed a hand over her heart and whispered to the judge, "I never asked them to speak, but it seems they remembered what the city chose to forget." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of meaning, of memory, of quiet resistance. The judge leaned back in his chair, hands folded, his eyes not on the paperwork anymore, but on Judith, on the quiet woman who had come with nothing but a notebook and the courage to speak when no one else would. The courtroom had returned to silence, but this silence was different. It wasn't hesitation or doubt, it was reverence. "I want to be very clear," Judge Garcia said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of every testimony heard. "The law, as it stands, does not allow me to restore land that has already been destroyed. I cannot undo what's been paved over." He paused, his gaze drifting briefly to the photograph Judith had placed earlier on the bench, a simple image of her and Henry standing in front of their orchard, smiling beneath a canopy of blossoms. It wasn't legal evidence, but it was human truth. "However," he continued louder now, "I can acknowledge a wrong. I can recognize when a system meant to serve its people instead silences them." Edwards shifted in his seat. He had no more objections to raise, no more papers to wave. The judge addressed the courtroom. "This case has exposed failures. Failures of notification, failures of transparency, and above all, failures of respect. The city's actions were procedurally flawed and ethically indefensible." He turned back to Judith. "Ms. Woods, I cannot give you back your trees, but I can order the city to formally apologize, to compensate you fairly for the loss of your home, and to open an immediate investigation into all similar demolitions over the past 5 years." Gasps escaped from several people in the room. A reporter scribbled furiously in a notepad. The gallery began to stir, and for the first time, Edwards looked like he wanted to disappear. Then Garcia did something unexpected. He stood. He took the photo from the bench and looked at it one last time before setting it down carefully beside Judith's notebook. "The law may be bound to paper," he said, "but justice begins in the heart. And today, Ms. Woods, you reminded this." A court of that, Judith pressed a hand to her mouth. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't cry. Instead, she gave a single nod, grateful, steady, and full of grace. Applause began softly in the back row. Then it spread, and soon the entire room was on its feet. The standing ovation swelled until the walls of the courtroom seemed to pulse with it. Not the kind of applause reserved for victory, but something softer, more sacred. It was gratitude, a collective exhale from a town that had just remembered what justice was supposed to feel like. Judith didn't raise her hands. She didn't wave or boo. She simply turned toward the crowd, notebook still pressed to her chest, and smiled through misty eyes. The lines on her face, once red as frailty, now glowed with strength. She had come into that room a forgotten figure, and now stood as a symbol of quiet resistance, of dignity that refused to be buried under concrete. Judge Garcia remained standing as well. He watched the moment unfold, not with pride, but with humility. This hearing had changed him. Deep down, he knew it. For all the years he had served behind that bench, applying law with surgical precision, it had taken an old woman and a dusty notebook to remind him that justice wasn't always black and white. Sometimes it lived in the gray areas, in stories, in memory, in handwritten notes that no one had cared to read. When the room finally calmed, Garcia made one final gesture. He walked down from the bench and approached Judith. The bailiff, unsure of protocol, hesitated, but didn't stop him. Standing before her, the judge extended his hand. "I've read thousands of cases," he said quietly, "but I'll remember yours for the rest of my life." Judith took his hand in both of hers and nodded. "Thank you for listening. That's all I ever wanted." Outside the courthouse, the news had already spread. A small crowd had gathered. Neighbors, former students, young mothers with strollers. They clapped as she stepped out the door, but Judith simply kept walking, slowly, peacefully, like someone who'd just set down a weight carried for far too long. At home there would be no orchard, no trees, no rows of peaches or the swing Henry built, but in her heart, and now in the hearts of many, something had been restored. Not land, but voice. And in the end, that's what changed everything. Weeks passed. The orchard, now a stretch of grey asphalt, bore no signs of the life it had once held. No blossoms, no laughter, no rustling leaves. Just the distant hum of cars moving over what used to be a garden of memories. But something unexpected began to take root, not in soil, but in people. Local schools invited Judith to speak to their students, not as a legal expert, but as a witness to what happens when we forget to listen. Churches and neighborhood groups began questioning other city projects, asking harder questions, demanding transparency. And in the center of it all was a woman who had never raised her voice, yet had moved an entire town with the simple force of truth. Judge Garcia, too, changed in quiet ways. On the wall behind his bench, where once there had only been plaques and certificates, now hung a photograph, Judith and Henry beneath the orchard's blossoms. Beside it, pinned with care, a copy of one of her handwritten letters to City Hall. Faded, smudged, but visible. A reminder that not all evidence comes in legal form. Mike Edwards resigned shortly after the case. Officially, he cited personal reasons. Unofficially, it was understood he had lost something more important than a courtroom argument. He had lost the trust of a community. As for Judith, she never asked for compensation beyond what was offered. With that money, she didn't move away or rebuild the home. Instead, she donated part of it to start a small community garden, open to children, the elderly, and anyone who needed a place to feel rooted again. She called it the orchard. That remains: no fences, no paperwork, just soil, seeds, and hands willing to tend them. Every Sunday, Judith could be found there, watering new saplings, showing a child how to plant a tomato, or simply sitting in the shade of a young tree that would one day grow strong and tall, because even when the land is taken, even when the past is paved over, some things like dignity, memory, and quiet courage can never truly be erased, and that, in the end, was the real victory. If this story touched your heart even a little, if it reminded you that kindness still matters, that courage can live in quiet places, and that justice, when truly seen, can change lives, then don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We share stories that honor everyday people, stories that need to be told, and voices that deserve to be heard. Your support helps us keep them alive, so hit that subscribe button and join us in spreading stories that move the world, one heart at a time.